so we can go over and get beer. Because we like beer. Okay. So, thank you for coming out. There's a lot of new faces. Let's see, what do we have going on? Aside from the fact that we decided to do tacos this time, so you're welcome. That's how much we love you guys. We also decided Mike is actually going to be running my JavaScript meetup next week. I will not be here. This is the first ever meetup that I have not been here for the whole, at least the beginning process. I'm kind of freaking out.
We also made another deal last week too.
About my my little app? That one?
No.
What was the other?
Oh,
yes.
We had, I had on very short notice asked to give a talk on JavaScript, and we committed her to that. And so I think the flip side to that was I said that Caitlin could task me with something. So I'm still waiting. You guys are welcome to throw suggestions at her.
Yep.
For it, but I am waiting for suggestions on it. So.
Yeah, you can message me through Meetup or Facebook or email. Most of you guys have all that info. Give me some suggestions. Let's kind of make this fun.
Absolutely.
All right. So, aside from that, I am looking for June and July iOS and Android, but I really don't think there's very many Android guys in here, if not just one. So June and July iOS and Android speakers. So, Iron Yard. Anybody else? Never heard of it. So definitely get up here and speak. You learn a lot when you get up here and speak. I mean, I learned a lot because then on top of what I built, which you guys will see later, I also then got criticized and got picked apart, and you learn a lot of things. It's not as scary. It's very casual to get up here and talk. It's really not as scary as you guys might think it is. But further ado, Joel, you're coming up and speaking.
Sweet.
So come on up. Let's get this rolling.
Awesome. All right, let's see. What do we got for connectivity?
Battery HDMI.
That works.
And there's that for you.
Excellent.
Let's make sure this wants to cooperate. Oh yeah, I like it when it works.
Test 1, 2, 3. Can you guys hear me? Test. Mic check, mic check. All right. Let me get things started here. Hold on. This will do. All right. So thank you guys for coming. Thanks CloudSpace for inviting me back to talk. Today we're going to be talking about automated mobile UI testing with Calabash. So I work for a company called Xamarin. We make cross-platform dev tools where you can write C# and target iOS, Mac, and Android. But again, today we're going to be talking about automated mobile UI testing, which is something that we definitely heard a lot from our customers. Before we get on with that, though, there's more important information that we need to handle. So. Over the last couple of meetings here at the university meetups, I kind of noticed a pattern starting to emerge. There's a lot of goats in the presentations. So, I was like, I should probably throw a couple of goats in my slide deck. But I was quickly rebuffed. And, they said, no, that's for the JavaScript meetups only. I was like, shit, all right, great. So then some of the Android guys... what was that?
It really got your goat.
It did really get my goat, yeah. So then some of the Android guys started talking about how they were going to start using sharks for the Android meetups, right? So here you got a shark eating a lollipop, Android lollipop. Anyways,
it's funny.
Yeah, that's right. Haha. So I was like, all right, well, I guess I'm going to be speaking at the next iOS meetup, so I wonder what thing we could use, and I propose bobcats. Yes, bobcats. Anyways.
Carrying out the shark.
Yes, carrying out the shark. Anyway, yeah, that's a. I'm actually kind of proud of that. It's a Florida story that got national attention. That wasn't Florida Man. Thank goodness. Anyways, so how many of you guys know what unit testing is? All right, got a handful of hands. Of the people that know what unit testing is, how many of you actually write unit tests? All right, so it's a slightly smaller amount of hands went up. Basically, testing quality is hard. I don't know about you guys, but I write a ton of bugs. Most of my time is actually spent debugging my own code. You guys are probably better programmers than I am, but this is just a thing that happens. Sometimes it's my fault. I mean, it's usually my fault. Sometimes it's not my fault. Sometimes people ask me for essentially the wrong thing. They kind of don't formulate their request in the right way. Sometimes I misunderstand what they're asking for. Sometimes it's just things that I haven't anticipated, or I just write crappy code, right? So I write code is going to be an internet connection, right? You guys write that kind of. It's just me, okay. Sometimes we can get a little bit too clever with our code. Our code gets very linked internally. So you have this module over here, depending on this module over here, that depends on 5 other modules, and so you change a piece of code over here that you're like, oh, this is an easy change, and all of a sudden 3 other things break that you're like, how the hell? And you know what? It happens. This is a reality. The reality of the industry. Very few groups have the resources. Like NASA has a really crazy software process. A lot of the sort of back-end corporate, big mature groups have started to kind of build out this whole culture of software quality, of having tests, of having continuous integration, deployment, and all this QA departments. A lot of the stuff which unfortunately I don't see whenever I talk to mobile developers, right? So a lot of times, I can't tell you how many times I've heard this, but when I'm talking to mobile developers, they're like, oh, I'd love to write tests, but it's really hard to convince the client to pay for that. And that's just kind of how things go. So obviously, testing is an integral part of the sort of quality process. And if you're going to be writing acceptance tests, you have to be easy to write, right? So a lot of times there are certain test frameworks that you have to be a developer to use them. But wouldn't it be great if you could actually get your non-technical business people involved? They have to not break, right? Because if you have this sweet batch of unit tests and you spend half your time debugging them and fixing 20 other things anytime you move around a button, that can be problematic. They have to actually test or be able to test in a realistic environment, right? So in the context of mobile development, as I'm sure a lot of you know, you can test everything in the simulator, but until you test it on a device, you might uncover things that the simulator just doesn't surface. And then going back to the sort of culture of like mature culture of quality, you got to be able to integrate it into a sort of continuous integration process. Not every project, not every group needs to get to this level, but if tests that you don't have to manually press the run button on are tests that actually get run. There have been cases, I'm sure you guys have experienced this, hopefully it's not just me. 3 months down the road, I sort of peek up from my desk and I'm like, hey, when was the last time anyone ran any of the tests? And they're like, what tests? I'm like, shit, damn it. But again, it totally happens. Please tell me it's not just me. But anyways, Calabash. So let me just go back here. So Calabash, it's an open source product. It's completely free. and it actually supports both iOS and Android. Obviously today nobody cares about those Android sharks, so we're going to be talking about iOS. And when the team that originally built this started working on it, their vision for the product was, a lot of the things that I said in an earlier slide, right? So they wanted non-technical users to be able to actually contribute to the quality process. They wanted the test to be realistic. They wanted the test to be executable. And so, that's what this framework sort of espouses and provides. It's sort of made of components, and once you understand them, it's really easy. So you have Calabash. Calabash is the framework. It's written in Ruby, and it uses, you write the main part of a lot of the tests using a dialect called Gherkin. And then you have a tool called Cucumber, right? And Cucumber is actually a separate thing, and you use Cucumber to execute Gherkin tests. That's a lot of hand wavy phrases, but it'll become a lot clearer here in a minute. The architecture is really simple. Just if you're curious a little bit about the internals, when you're using Calabash, it runs a little HTTP server in the app that gets deployed to either the simulator or the device, and this talks over HTTP to the computer that's running the test, and the process is going to be run and managed through Cucumber, and it talks to that HTTP server in the app using the Calabash API. Android is mostly similar. There's just a couple of sort of architectural differences just based on the way iOS and Android work. So in this case, it's actually a separate service from the app, whereas on iOS, it's actually compiled into the app. Adding tests to a project is it's actually really simple. So again, this is all sort of built on top of Ruby and a lot of that infrastructure like gems. So to get started, all you do is do gem install Calabash Cucumber. That's going to bring down all the dependencies and get everything set up. Of course, you have to have Ruby installed prior to that and gem and everything. Once the Calabash Cucumber gem installs, then you get this nice command called calabash-ios. You go into the directory where one of your Xcode projects lives, and you can just do calabash iOS setup. And what that does is that it sets up a separate target in your project that when you compile that target, it actually links against the Calabash Cucumber framework and starts up the web server and all that stuff. But you don't have to worry about that. All you got to do is compile that target. And then there's this handy little command called calabash iOS gen. And what this does is it just kind of bootstraps a couple of a very basic simple test and some of a couple different files so that you can start writing new tests. And I'll show you what that looks like here in a minute. And then finally, once you get everything set up, you just compile that target, your app towards that target, and then you just type Cucumber on the command line, and the magic happens. And I'm actually going to show you kind of what that looks like. So because it's a different target, all this stuff actually doesn't to your production application. It actually, so your production code isn't going to see any kind of performance implications. It's not going to be bigger. It all gets compiled out when you go to push to the App Store and everything. And you can kind of see it goes through and it executes all the tests. It kind of launches the simulator, deploys the app, runs the tests, and gathers the results of whether everything worked, everything didn't. Gives you this nice little report. And there's a couple different ways that you can format it. You can put it out to a file, whatever. You can also run this against an actual device. So an iPhone, an iPad, they've got sitting there connected to this computer. And you can see here, 4 scenarios, 12 steps, they're all passed. I can show you. Can you guys see this? Maybe make it a little bit bigger. So this is actually the test or the bootstrapped files that it gives you. So it gives you a very simple feature. So you have this, in this case, my first.feature, and you can have multiple features, and we'll go over some of the syntax here. But you can see here, you've got a little description. Running a test as an iOS developer, I want to have a sample feature file so I can begin testing quickly. And then in the one scenario that it gives you, it says example steps. Given that I'm on the welcome screen, then I swipe left, and I wait until I don't see a please swipe left, or until I don't see please swipe left. So this was actually written for just a simple sample app that shows this text and then has you swipe, and then that message goes away. And then it takes a picture. So if you take a look at, never mind. The test that I ran wasn't this particular one. But this is what it looks like. And we're going to go over some of those details here in a minute. Let's see, go back to Keynote and play. So adding tests to a project is really simple. Getting started is really simple. And I should have gone forward one. Come on. So you notice that in that features file, it was just text. There wasn't any code as you would normally imagine code to be, right? So they were all sentences. They were all very simple to write. It encourages a type of development called behavior-driven development. And this is actually a little bit of an evolution with test-driven development, except, well, slightly different. You're not writing you're not writing tests against your code. You're writing tests against your application. And so the process for adding a feature to your application or to your service would basically go like this. You get with your business stakeholders, whoever it is that pays your bills or manages you, even if it's yourself. But even if it's yourself, it's helpful to go through this process, right? So you imagine a new feature, then you get together with this person and you write these features and scenarios, and you can write them with the non-technical user. Like I said, it looks like regular old text, and then you write a bunch of code until those tests pass. And then once those tests pass, then you go through, you add more features, and then you can always be sure that these scenarios will always pass no matter what. So in that features file, right, that's a sort of dialect called Gherkin, right? And it's a very specific format. So you have a bunch of keywords, right? So you have scenario, given, when, and then, right? So you can kind of read this out like a story, and in fact, that's what it's often called. It's called a user story. So you said, okay, so for this scenario, we're going to have multiple given keywords. So given one thing, given another thing, given yet another thing. When I open my eyes, then I see something, then I don't see something else, right? So the given keyword, they're usually like preconditions, right? So they're like, given that I'm logged in as a certain user, given that I don't have an internet connection, given that I do this, that, and the other thing. So this is basically setting up the preconditions for the test, right? Because sometimes you have a test on a screen that's 5 screens deep, and you don't want to write that out, that navigation out every time, right? So you can say, given that I'm on, the settings screen, and that kind of stuff just happens, and we'll get to how. Then when I open my eyes, this is what the user actually does, right? So in this case, the user is opening his eyes. It can be tapping, and entering text, so on and so forth. And then the assertions, right? So you're saying, then I should see one thing, and I should, not see something else. You can kind of rewrite this using ands and buts. So you're given one thing and another thing and yet another thing. When I open my eyes, then I see something, but I don't see something else. So it kind of reads a little bit easier. It's a paragraph, it's a story, and it makes total sense to an English-speaking user. And by the way, you can actually write this in multiple languages if you are so inclined. There's a lot of predefined steps, right? So these are things that are built into the Calabash framework. So it's things like when you touch a label or a button, when you scroll to a certain item in a list and tap on that, when you toggle a switch. A lot of these things are built in so that you don't have to write custom code every time. You can fill in data, right, by saying, when I enter some text into a certain field. And a lot of, or actually all of this is actually predicated, it's very simple. In your app, all you have to do is set the accessibility identifier of any view that you want to be able to interact with in the Gherkin language or even in Calabash. So as soon as you set the accessibility identifiers, then you can interact with it in these scripts. So in this case, there's a bunch of different formats, right? So you can do it simple. I enter X into Y, or you can have this table if you have like a long form, so it's really easy to read. You can assert things. I want to wait until I see a certain label or until I see a certain view. You can do subtext, right? So just as long as it says logged in somewhere, or it says a username somewhere, whatever. Success, fail. You can wait. You can hit the back button. There's pretty much everything that a user can do are listed in predefined steps. Scrolling, rotating. You can take pictures so that you can sort of document along the way. But you can also write custom steps, right? So a lot of times it would be kind of tedious to sort of have every step listed every time you want to write a test. So you can actually write custom tests, and they're really easy to write. I'll show you here in a second. You can write custom steps that use, whatever your business is, you should write in the language of that business, right? So if you're talking to physicists and you're making an app for physicists, it should be understandable to the physicist that you're talking to. Like the features file should be understandable to the person that you're talking to, that they're the ones with the business knowledge and all the information. So you can write all these custom steps using Ruby, and you can pretty much do everything at that point. And I'll just show you here real quick. And by the way, if anybody has any questions, feel free to let me know. But this is what a slightly more complicated feature file might look like. So this is actually the test that I ran earlier, right? So this is a credit card validation app, right? Very simple sample application. But you can see up here that it says these are using predefined steps, which by and large, they're there because they're easy to use, but they're not really recommended for anything that is non-trivial. Right, so this is like, given I use the native keyboard to enter blah, blah, blah into a text field, and then I touch this button, so on and so forth. But that doesn't really read, super easily, right? So when you start writing custom steps, you can do things like, the scenario is that the credit card number is too long. So given that I'm on the main screen, and I try to validate a credit card that's 17 characters long, then I should see the error message, credit card number is too long, right? So that's really easy. So if you take a look here, there's a step definitions folder, and this totally gets generated by that handy gen folder or command. And then you can just come in here and start editing using your favorite Ruby editor, right? So here's a custom step, right? So you're writing a custom given, and it says I try to a credit card that is, D characters long, right? And this is actually just a simple what's the word I'm looking for? Regular expression, right? And you can actually pass in custom parameters to this custom step, right? So then at that point you can start using the Calabash Ruby API and doing things like, just wait for this element to show up in the tree view, in the view hierarchy, right? So this is going to be a text field marked with this accessibility identifier. Then I want you to clear the text, so whatever's there, just clear it out, and then enter the text. And and then at this point you can start just writing regular Ruby code, especially if you know Ruby. This is really simple, right? So this is just 99999, however many parameter, whatever number you pass into that custom step. And then you just touch this button, marked validate button, right? So behind the scenes, it can get, then, this is what you're paid to do, right? You're paid to write code. But the person that is not paid to write code, that doesn't understand code, can sit here and they can even write these, right? They can just say, oh, when I try to validate a credit card number that's 17 characters long, I should see this message. So you can work really closely with a non-technical user to actually work and update and maintain these steps. And like I mentioned, this is Calabash iOS, right? So it works with iOS, but Calabash also totally works with Android. You can, if you're careful about the way you write your apps, you can even reuse the same exact tests, right? And so there's a lot of different cases out there. When you actually publish your app, right, users are going to have different operating system versions. They're going to have different devices, especially on Android, right? You've got this sort of explosion, different screen sizes, which of course that same explosion is sort of coming to iOS with watches and iPads and gigantic phones. But a lot of times, a lot of people just test on their own personal devices, and they don't test on an iPhone 6 or whatever, right? So this is kind of problematic. And so there's a product that Xamarin, it's a service that Xamarin provides. It's called Xamarin Test Cloud. Take your Calabash tests, right, which of course you can totally run locally in your own data center, on your machine, however you want to configure that, using your own CI server, Jenkins, whatever. You can even set up, a bank of your own devices. However you want to organize that, you can totally do that. It's free. It's open source. You can write pull requests on it. You can fork it. But if you want to write against, I think the last count was like 100 different devices, all running on different operating system versions, different tablets, phones, Android, iOS, all this crazy stuff. We have this service, and I can show you what that looks like here in a minute. But that is an option if you have an app that you want to push out to a wider audience, things like that. So you can make sure that your customers are going to get a tested product on, chances are on their device. You can also, if you're using Test Cloud, you can also write your tests in C# if you're so inclined, but you totally don't have to. And actually, before I get to that, I'll just show you real quick the Test Cloud API. So as of earlier when I loaded this page, there's almost 1,500 devices, and you can actually see screenshots of them right here. And when you run a test, you can see here on the left, you can actually see all of the features and scenarios, right? So you have assignments, and you have a scenario login with valid user proceeds to assignments, and you can see every step listed right here, along with a screenshot on every device that this test was run on. And when you click on the next step, you actually see what that looked like, and so on and so forth. And then in this case, you see a failed test, right? So when I log in as invalid, right? So then I should not be logged in, but in this case, this particular sample app still logs you in, right? So that's a problem. And so you can find things like that. You can find things on devices with different screen sizes, things of that nature. And that's it. That's kind of everything that I wanted to talk to you guys about. Feel free to send me any emails, or if you have any questions, find me afterwards. And thank you guys.
No more questions? Any questions, guys?
Questions? Yeah.
Already work on the Apple Watch?
I'm sorry?
Does it already work on the Apple Watch?
It does not work on the Apple Watch in the sense that that's actually a good question. I'm going to find out. But
You can't really send accessibility commands to it.
yeah, that might be something that's not there. But
It works on Wear. Just throwing that out there.
I'm sorry?
It works on Wear. So
Yeah, Android Wear, because that's a full-on little Android device sitting on your wrist. So, and in that case, it probably also works on Google Glass for, that's the next big thing, right, guys? So, anyways, any other questions? Yeah.
How would you tackle the issue of using this for integration testing with the backend API?
So that's a real great question. The question for the YouTube stream, perhaps, how do you handle making tests that have to deal with backend APIs and databases and things like that? That's in general not an easy question. One thing you might do is that for every step, right? So, all right. So say in your test builds, say you include like a custom settings menu item, and you can click on that settings menu item and press a button in there. And whenever you press that button, it switches everything to use a mocked-up API or a mocked-up database connection or whatever your externalized piece of data is. So then in your custom tests, you can make sure that every time you start a test, you always have the test go through and press that button so that all your tests are no longer going out against the database or the internet, whatever. But in any case, when you're running on the actual devices, you're going to have internet, whatever capability the device you're connecting to has. You can kind of, if that kind of thing is important to you, to make sure you don't test against production, or maybe you like a staging API, you can make those changes right in the test, and you just kind of have to be creative about it. So awesome, thank you. Feel free to ask me any questions afterwards. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Mindy. Give me your mic. So as Brandon's getting up here and setting up, couple things. If you came in late, I have tacos back there. I'm going to keep pushing it. Eat. Go eat tacos. Go. Less leftovers, the better. Also, too, raise your hand for me if you did not get a ticket so I can give you a ticket. All right, I got you guys. All right. So I'll come to you guys. What else was I going to say? Oh, our Wi-Fi's up. It actually legitimately is now. So you can use UTech. There you go, my dear. And okay. Take it. Huh? I don't need it. No. No. You'll see why in a bit. All right. I got it.
That works. Wait on you.
Yes, but it's on college right now. That's a private repo.
Dude, you were asking for somebody to yell at you.
For what?
On the back of the phone. Windows phone. Love it. You should really have a sticker at the top that says Samsung Galaxy S6.
That'd be sweet.
That would be. Just round it a little, rebrand it.
Just mill out a whole new case.
Same thing, right?
Yeah.
got it.
Okay. All right, go ahead.
All right. So my name's Brandon, and I'm doing the presentation on iOS 8's new Photos framework. So I'm not familiar with how many of you have messed with the current iOS 7 Photos framework, which is just the assets library. Have any of you messed with that before at all? Pulling photos, writing to camera roll, letting users select photos. Well, this is what's new and makes life easy for everybody. So what is the Photos framework? This is a framework that Apple has written to work seamlessly with iCloud and your general Photos albums. It's kind of a replacement for the assets library. You can still use the assets library, but it pretty clearly states that it's been depreciated in favor of this library. And if you do use this library, trust me, you'll prefer it. It allows you to access everything, down to the albums that you have inside your Photos framework, to what's been favorited, and it allows you to edit those and save them directly to the library, which is really nice. It's a one-place go-to place to allow editing, access, reading, displaying, instead of having a generic kind of camera roll just pop up, let you select photos, import them into your app, and having your own management system inside there. That, to me, is pretty big. And the best part is, when you do read the information in, it handles memory and networking for you. You don't have to worry about fetching data from iCloud. You don't have to worry about, is my app going to run out of memory, or anything along those lines whatsoever. It is pretty smart in the way that it handles everything. And it has been tested. And I have to explicitly state that because when the iCloud framework originally came out, one of the problems was Apple had not used it inside of any of their applications, same as when Swift first launched. So there were many problems to be found, many things that were wrong, and many things that weren't preferable for developers. This framework was used to develop the new Photos app. So if you open up the Photos app on iOS 8 on any phone, everything and anything that's inside of it, you can write. You can write it using this framework right here, which is pretty impressive. It's exclusive. They don't use Assets framework. They don't use any other libraries whatsoever. It was made and advertised to dog food us right here.
And the collection views.
Oh, native. I'll get into that. So, yes. Tell more. So, what are you going to be dealing with when you mess with this framework? All model objects inside of the Photos framework have an abstract class called phObject. This class is pretty self-described in the fact that anything that inherits from it and it itself is a lightweight metadata-based object. It doesn't contain any kind of image data, any kind of database like large chunks, no heaps of data at all. It just contains information describing the data that you want and you should have. This makes it really easy to manage, really easy to fetch many objects and display them all at the same time without worrying about memory. Now, on top of this, you'll have your major class that you'll care about, which is a PH asset. This is one individual asset. It can be an image, it can be a video. In the future, it might be something else. We don't really know. But it contains metadata for an asset that's within the Photos framework. This is a custom collection that they have created that describes something like an album that you have in there. It's basically a collection of assets, and it's ordered. And this is a collection of collections. And the best part, they're all immutable. And I have to point this out. That means if you're multi-threading, if you're doing things on many different threads and you're fetching data here, fetching data there, you don't have to worry about manipulating any of the data and causing some kind of data corruption or syncing problem, because they're immutable. Once you get them back, you can't change them. They're meant to be what they're meant to be. In all honesty, the way that this framework's set up, I really wish Core Data was set up like it. Makes me very happy. Now, how do we get these objects? These objects, Apple has seemed to gone down a major route between singletons and class methods for fetching these objects. It's very akin to something like parse, if you've used that before. And what you'll get back from every fetch that you make is a pH fetch result object. And you'll very commonly see a pH fetch result where you get the first result because you only want a collection of something or a generic thing. And the way you specify what you want inside this fetch result is through pH fetch options. These fetch results are like NS arrays. They're arrays of data. They have similar interfaces that go back and forth. But the best part is, if you've ever messed with Core Data before, you've been able to fetch in batches. And you're able to specify batches, and there's an abstraction from you in what's being loaded on the backside. You could specify a batch of 20, a batch of 50, and in your array, it doesn't actually have that much data, but it will give you the proper count size, it will give you the objects when you ask for them. This will do the exact same thing. It will lazy load for you. And I think that's quite fetching. No laughs. This would be an example of a typical fetch where you would just construct the fetch. You'd pass it in some options like a sort descriptor, and you would fetch assets, or you would fetch assets in an asset collection. And you can notice at the very bottom where the fetch is being performed, that is a class method. So pH assets is typically what you pipeline that through to get any sort of assets that you're expecting back and forth. But it's a fairly straightforward process right here, and there's really no wait. When you fetch this, don't expect it to take long. Don't expect it to take a long process. All this information is pretty there for the grabs, and it's going to give it to you like that. Now, the options allow you to specify a multitude of different data, including which objects you want, object arrangement, how you want them sorted, and how they should notify you of changes. Because just like Core Data, this is a general library that many things can manipulate. So you want to get these notifications in to tell you, hey, this has changed, so you can update your table view or your collection view or whatever's displaying your data at that given time. And you can pretty much specify whether to tell you everything or to tell you some things. And you can see all the properties here on your options. You have specified predicates that are inside here. You have include burst assets. You have a pretty good amount of control. And if you want to get more technical right here, Apple does a pretty good job at specifying the supported keys. So this is the area that you'll look for if you're running any kind of predicates on anything, looking for titles, dates, identifiers, etc. Now for loading content itself, remember that pH asset and pH object are just metadata containers. They're not data, they're descriptions of data. So what you'll do is you'll pass that object to this object right here. When you want the data, then you fetch the data, and you do it on an individual basis. And honestly, I haven't had any slowdowns, no issues loading that, so I wouldn't be too concerned about that. And they do everything asynchronously, which you'll see. So this manager will handle caching, asynchronous calls, and even resizing of assets, which I greatly appreciated myself. If any of you have written image-based code before displaying something, usually you'll have to do cropping manually. You sometimes have to still, because it doesn't guarantee that it's going to give you size back, but I haven't had an instance yet where it hasn't cropped it properly for me. Usually that's determined by if it takes too long to do the cropping. Photos will do whatever it can do the quickest. So if you're cropping a very large site image and you're doing something really complicated, then it's going to give you the large size image first.
So,
Yes.
so when you go through to display a list or a collection view, is it the image manager that's going to give you like the small, like thumbnail?
See, it's interesting because it can do multiple things depending on what you tell it to do. It can give you different quality of images. You can specify to give me a low quality image, the quickest quality image, high quality image. And if you specify certain things, you can get multiple callbacks because it's within a block. So you'll get the low quality image first, and then as soon as it can, it will upgrade it to a high quality image. And also, like I was saying before, you can specify a crop rect, which will resize that image for you. So you can do both all at the same time. And unfortunately, you will have to have that check in code to make sure that the size is correct, just because it's not guaranteed. But this would be an example right here where you use the default manager, which you can create your own instances, just like NS user defaults or other singleton-based patterns that Apple has used. And you would request an image for data asset. They have multiple calls like this where you can request for the raw data, you can request for the image, so just return an image. Depending on what you want, you'll want to look through those and see whatever suits whatever you want to do the quickest, because if you're going to get data and convert it to a UI image, who knows what Apple's doing on the backside, and you may just be doing what they've already done. So might as well just get the image back. But this right here also provides a bit of data that you don't get back in the other APIs, which is that data UTI. And depending on the information, I have had issues where I don't get info on certain calls, and I do get info on this call every single time. And that would be specific data about the images, such as a hidden key that I found that isn't documented that specifies the image's actual name on disk. That's non-existent in the other calls. It's only existent in this call. As with the other calls, this also has a list of options that you can choose from. And the neat part is, with editing, you can specify customized data for your edits, for your application specifically. You can specify a domain so you know that it's your application, and you can specify data and a version. Using these in conjunction, you are able to pretty much deserialize what changes have been made to this particular asset inside your application itself, which is pretty cool because it means you can undo the changes and you can let the user change them again. It also provides you with a progress handler, which I was a fan of with parse, so I'm really happy to hear that. That's in case it takes too long to either fetch the image because it's too large or it's getting it over iCloud or something along those lines. Now for caching, if you want to do caching manually, there is a subclass of the image manager that is a caching image manager. And what this allows you to do is specify what assets you would like to pre-cache before everything comes up. So if one isn't efficient enough for you, you could say, I want the first 30 photos and the next 30 photos on top of that. And these are the general methods that you would use. You'd have to pass in generic indexes to say what to do. But one thing that I do want to note, and it's probably on the next slide, is that with this caching, PhotoKit is, the Photos framework is very, very picky about its caching, kind of like NSFetch results with caching. If anything changes within the options, it will no longer use the cache. It will use a new cache. It will go and fetch everything over again. So if you change the image size, like the rect, it's going to change its cache. If you change fetching from the network, it's going to change its cache. Any of that information will cause it to change. And you can see here the target size is the specified crop. Yep. And that's pretty much that. So completely disregard the old cache and fetch an entirely new version of that image with a new cache. Now, As in most of the frameworks that you deal with in iOS, it does require permissions to access. You can't just dive into the Photos library and get the user's information without it. So the first time that you call fetch, it will prompt the user, whether you want it to or not, for those permissions. So this process is kind of automated for you, which is really nice. And it will asynchronously do everything, so nothing will lock you up waiting on some kind of response. Everything will process as norm until the user has provided a response. If the user doesn't grant permissions, everything will fail, and you will get an empty fetch result object back. This would be a simple example of doing fetch results. So it's just like requesting for location data or anything like that. And mind you that all requests that are done are once again asynchronous. That's why you see the dispatch to the main thread, because it's probably going to come back asynchronously. And I've tested that a few times, and the majority of the times it is on a different thread. So it's your responsibility to handle that. Now, this is the generic photo library. This is what you could consider to be the universal container that holds all the photos, all of the different assets, etc. All requests to change the library, such as adding an album, adding a collection, adding a photo, they will all go through this. And a change request is how you change things, because remember before I said everything is immutable. You can't just access a property on it and say, I favorited this. You have to create a change request and say, I would like to favorite this. And then you have to apply that change request, which is really nice because once again, it prevents that kind of odd state that core data and other managers have. And as you would see here, these are more options that you can provide to edit, delete, and they all go through change requests. Yes. And more editing options. I'll show an example on how this is used, because this is a lot of data to take in. But typically when you make a change request, you'll get an editing input, and you'll use that editing input in conjunction with an app to create a versioned image. So judging by this data that you're provided, you'll be provided data that describes the assets, describes the adjustment data, describes the version and what's been changed, which is really nice because it pretty much gives you everything you could possibly want to reverse everything that you've done and move forward with it and say if it's valid or invalid. Yes. And that's basically the result, which is a recipe to say whatever you want to revert, whatever you want to do, how this was created, etc. But as you can see here, this is a simple favoriting a photo. You know how you have the heart inside your Photos app, and you can favorite it, unfavorite it, and it will add it into its own section. Right here, what you're doing is you're creating a change request using a specific asset. You say, I want to change this asset, and I would like to change in this request the favorite to whatever the opposite of the current favorite is. And you let it go through. If you don't get an error back, if there are no problems, you're good. And the best part is it handles the order of everything. It'll handle, its own threading, etc. So however it works, you don't have to worry about the mutability state. You just say, I would like to change this, hand it off, and it will do the magic for you. And this is where it gets a little bit more complicated, but the good part about this is how you get a recipe going with an image. You'll get the versioning, you'll get the recipe, you'll be able to write whatever you want here. You see how there's an example of a JPEG that you're adding inside there. You're modifying it, you're writing it to disk, and you're also specifying a version that you have. And that version goes in adjustment format identifier version 1.0. So using that identifier, you know your app did this. You know it's under the API version 1.0. So you know what it did, how it did it, and what to do. And the best part about this is that data field, any serialized data that you want can go there. It does have a limit to how much data you can provide there. So don't expect to go, like 3 megs insane with it. But Apple kind of doesn't specify the limit. It just says don't go crazy with it. But because this data is serializable, you can place whatever you want. You could place labels of content filters that were applied to it, what order they were applied to it. You can place cropping information inside of it and strings. You can place versions, how many images were added, the image names, the identifiers for the images. That pretty much gives you everything that you need right there. And you'll see here, the key thing is that perform change block. That perform change block is what's going to get you that output. And that output is going to be pretty much the request. And once it goes through, it's a success or failure. Now, observing changes is important because you're dealing with a data container with everything else that can modify it at the same time. It doesn't have to be your app, could be another app. Your app could be in the background not listening for something and some widget could come up and modify it. You don't know. But a ph change object will notify you of the changes that go through. You'll get details along with that for specific assets that you'll request before and after the changes occur. Because the objects are immutable, you can have both states, it doesn't matter, and you can compare the objects and say, I want to revert you back. And fetch results have their own set of change details. These all tie in together pretty much in a chain order where you get a detail of fetch results. When you make a fetch result, you kind of, by default, sign up to listen in for changes. You just need to conform to the protocol. And when you get a callback, when those changes come in, you'll basically go down this change where you'll get details for a specific asset object. And this key by default is inside of your options, which I highlighted earlier. This specifies how much information you want back regarding the change. If you ask for incremental changes, it will give you everything, absolutely everything you could possibly imagine. If you set this to no manually, what you're essentially doing is saying, I don't really care about this information, I just want to update my UI. And that would be the generic register. Notice how you're using the photo library to listen in on it. None register. And this is specifically Apple's wording on this. When you register yourself as a change observer, the Photos framework doesn't spam you with notifications. It's implicitly, it's assumed when you make a fetch result, you care about those fetches. You only care about that information. Unlike core data where you're listening in on a specific context, anything that you didn't fetch, you can get a notification for. And you have to filter that out manually. This will not spam you like that. It will only care about whatever you've done a fetch for. As you can see here, this is a simple example of listening in for changes and updating your table view. You pretty much go through and you say, okay, what are the change details for my current assets that are favorited? So you get that change detail list. Exists. That means there were in fact changes. And then you're going to want to fetch again. You're going to update your results and you're going to reload your table view. It's pretty much as simple as that. And once again, I'll emphasize, because of the immutability, you don't have to do this one by one. You could do this in batch. You don't have to worry about time synchronizations, user interaction. You don't have to lock down anything. You just say, I've changed this. Here you go. Update. Collection views are a bit more complicated. and they always have been. But the nice part about this is Apple went out of their way to specifically build in functions that are made for collection views. And that's what I can't say enough how appreciative this is, because if you've ever used an NSFetch result controller with a collection view before, you have to go out of your way to worry about animation states and all of this other stuff. So here you'll see how there are specific indexes that it provides you for removed objects, added objects, moved objects. You could see old indexes, new indexes. There's actually even an enumeration function that provides you with objects in their old indexes and new indexes. So you can do the manual adjustments and you don't have to worry about enumerating over index paths and worrying, oh, was this object? Did this get moved over? Or something like that. You explicitly say old or new indexes. And you'll be able to update your collection view as needed. So I have a demo. And this app was written in probably 3 hours of learning this. So that gives you like a pretty big emphasis on how simple this is. I literally read the documentation for this and produced this product in 3 hours, give or take, which I like to say because the faster you can understand and do something and work with it and it work properly, the better. Yeah. And you see here that all these images are inside of here. This is all pulled from the Photos library. This is silky smooth. And
now, real quick question: Are those duplicated or?
No, that was me copying and pasting everything but my own photo album inside there. So no, and I can actually import them and show you from the names using that hackery trick. You can see here that I can interact with this. This is just a regular collection view with images inside of it. And I'd like to emphasize again how silky smooth the scrolling is. If you've ever had this many images, you'd expect a lot more jitter from here. But if I go ahead and import them over here, you'll see that I just grabbed all these images. I imported them from the library, and I did my own compression and I saved them to core data. So, and note the image names over here. But yeah, and listing albums, you can see individual albums inside of here and you have a lot more finite control over it. Apple has their own demo project that's up and available if you go looking for it inside their documentation. Their particular demo is pretty robust. Honestly, I think if you siphon through it, you could build your own Photos app out of it. I was pretty impressed with how much they put out there. And you'll see here that the caching is probably the most complicated part with manual dispatches, but I want to show you right here where I fetch the images itself. I have just fetch result. I make a request operation. I say you can do this over the internet if you'd like. So everything that you just saw was via internet access allowed. I have a cropping size, which is that small. That's why all of them were uniform, fairly uniform in size. The content mode is also very nice because you can specify if you want to fill or if you want to aspect fit. And I get a callback and I just update it with the data that I got. It's easy as that. So any questions?
So a lot of apps, that deal with photos, they pretty much just, you hit the little button, gives you two options: take a photo or just, kind of bring up the built-in, sheet, whatever.
Best part about this is you don't have to use the built-in sheet anymore.
Well, right. but like, since you've been thinking about this probably a lot more than a lot of us here, can you kind of talk about any use cases where, just sort of not depending on that sheet and, just kind of dealing or having your own custom, interface would make sense?
Honestly, working with designers for the longest time, they hate the non-custom interface. And they usually design the app to be in such a way where you can just cycle through things. The ease of this is you can add a collection view and add a photos album kind of view inside of your application itself, and you can have a completely custom feel where it feels 100% separate from whatever you had before. Something as simple as selecting a profile picture or something along those lines. You even have access to albums such as faces inside of here. So something interesting that you would be able to do is you could add a filter for specific face names inside of here, and you could say, okay, this is Brandon Levasseur profile. I want to get faces of Brandon Levasseur for his profile, and then you could create a custom picker out of that and let them cycle through their faces. So that kind of finite control allows you to go through your own kind of flow versus having a modal come up out of nowhere. Unfortunately, some people like cluttering UIs and stuff like that. Well, this allows it to go with that flow instead of interrupting the UI with something that's completely external. Kind of like an inline camera ordeal, which I'm sure that many people have worked with, having a custom camera versus taking a picture with the other camera. Unfortunately, that doesn't give you as much control as this would give right here, but they've pretty much opened up everything inside this framework. Like for example, if you were to do a modal with a camera, you don't have zooming capabilities or flash, like full flash control and full zooming capabilities. And the rest of it, you're kind of limited with what you could do, which you end up defaulting to Apple stuff because of that. But if there's any kind of instance where it makes sense for you to have, like, you've got a really nice design going on here and you don't want to break the flow of it, this is a simple way to go up. Something as simple as I've had to do categories before to change colors of navigation bars and headers and back buttons inside of modals. Like now I don't have to do any kind of hackery to get around that. I just make my own fairly quickly, and it takes me about 10, 20 minutes longer. It's kind of worth it in my opinion, especially when I have a fully customizable interface.
Yeah, it's a great answer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So any other questions?
All right.
Okay,
We're good.
we're good.
All right, so those tickets, you might want to get those out. And I'm doing something to save myself, unlike I did last week, where I decided to troll my own meetup. So I'm stopping the streaming before I plug my laptop in, just to make sure of this. So with that being said, streaming is now done. Not